And now we are recording. Eric, thank you so much for joining me. For everyone that has not heard of Captain Allen on X, this is Eric Ruben. He made a Twitter or X account a few months ago, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and is quickly blowing up because he is truly and honestly the most knowledgeable person I know when it comes to Israel and Jewish history. It's amazing. Just when I came across his account personally, I was blown away by his professionalism, his knowledge. He has shared with me in another conversation that he has a 3,000 page book, so to speak, being written right now, and just over a lot of years of everything that he's learned. And it's really incredible. It's awesome and an honor to have you on. I'm excited for the conversation. So thank you for coming on. Welcome.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the compliments very much. I work really hard, so it's nice to know that there are some folks out there who appreciate it. Certainly feels good.
I think there's plenty of us. I think the more we can do to spread your name and just make sure that you are one of the voices that we really champion here, I think you're going to be a big name in however big this field is, so to speak. I think you'll be one of the bigger names in it, and pure meritocracy. Like you really deserve to be. And on that note, I'll let you dive into your history.
For me, just to start out with, I've been working as an attorney for the last 15 years, doing civil defense trial work for the most part. So that's been, my bread and butter. That's been the way I made a living. It's the way I supported my family. But my passion in life has always been Jewish and Israeli history, Jewish identity questions, and then especially as I became a lawyer, and the way that people speak about Israel all the time in terms of international law, but they say it over and over in ways that are not actually accurate. And it's one of those things where you say something like, for example, the illegal occupation. Okay. First of all, there's a question of whether or not there even is an occupation legally. And secondly, even if there was an occupation, since there's still belligerency, it's legal. It's not illegal. So I'm just saying that, my background has been in history for the most part, Jewish and Israeli history. I try to stay out of the political arena for this particular project that I'm working on now, as well as I try to stay out of the religious arena because I want this to be really academic in nature. I want to only be presenting historically verifiable facts or based on my legal analysis based off of actual precedent or treaties or international norms that I can point to, so that way it's a source that you can fact check me on. And I'm human, so I may make a mistake every now and then, and if I do, I'm willing to admit it. In fact, mistakes, I think, are actually good because it means there's always something more to learn. So I'm happy if somebody can point out to me that I made an error somewhere, because as much as I've been studying this now for the last 22 years of my life, I learn something new every day. And so in addition to being a lawyer, it really started for me going back about 22 years now to college, where I studied Jewish and Israeli history and Middle Eastern history, and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and spent a semester abroad at Cambridge in England, and focused on the British Mandate period. Very interesting thing to do, and to then have to write a paper and argue my paper with a Cambridge professor who was not inclined toward a stance that was in line with my own. And so the conversation was actually one of the most fascinating of my life. And the fact is, he gave me the highest grade and invited me out for drinks afterward. And we just kept on talking throughout the night. And it was a swell of pride for me at that point, because I knew a lot less then than I know now. But I wanted to score some points with him so badly because I respected him so much. I spent weeks and weeks of my life at the Cambridge Library, and people go abroad to go where the drinking age is 18 and to have fun and stuff like that. And I did certainly still enjoy my time there, but I became obsessed, and that's really what started all of this. So that was, over 20 years ago. And I had all of my notes from my time spent at the Cambridge Library. And when I got back, I kept studying, courses on Israeli and Jewish history and the conflict and things like that. And I just kept adding to those notes. I didn't know what I was doing it for. I didn't have anything in mind. I still don't exactly know what all role it's going to play. But the bottom line is, even throughout my 15 years as an attorney, there's never been there might be maybe a day here or there, but basically every single day since, for those 20 plus years, I've been either reading a book on Israeli or Jewish history. I read 6 different newspapers online every day, from the Middle East and about the Middle East. And whenever I come across in any of these books or documentaries that I find to be of interest, I was just adding it to my notes. And I did write a couple of papers in law school on Israel as well. And so the notes just grew. And so now it's over 20 years. Yeah, it's about 3,000 single spaced pages. That's overwhelming and insane. But what I've tried to do more recently is to organize it, more into a timeline order as best I can. But I can't tell you how incredibly long that takes for 3,000 pages. So it'll be a project that I'm working on for some time. But basically, what happened is about 2 years ago, and you and I discussed this a little bit, before we got on. I noticed something a little different in the air, and it was happening before then, for sure. I saw that things were getting much more uncomfortable for kids on university campuses and the way that they were being treated, and the anti-Semitism and the way in which students were being treated simply for being a Zionist, which at least 90% of all Jews are Zionists. So it's basically one and the
Very
same.
quickly,
Yeah.
can you define what Zionist means? Because this is one of those words, the one that I use as an example for everyone that aren't Jewish. What I hear is like, think feminist. Like when you hear feminist, you're gonna think something different than what a leftist thinks versus what someone on the right thinks. And like, but when at the end of the day, feminist means you believe both sexes should have equal rights. That's all it means. So really quickly, it'd be great if you just define Zionist.
Yeah. Zionism actually has a very simple definition, and it breaks my heart that Zionism is these days used as a slur in a lot of different circles. The very simple definition, the easiest way to think of Zionism is that it's the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. But the actual definition of Zionism is the belief that the Jewish people are a normal people who therefore have the right to self-determination in their ancient homeland, in at least some part of that land. That's all that it means. It means that they believe that a state of Israel has the right to exist. That's why anti-Zionism, these days people say, and I agree with, is anti-Semitism, because anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israeli policies. If that were the case, then every single Jew and non-Jew in Israel would be an anti-Zionist and an anti-Semite, because everybody argues about everything about politics over there. No, it's a vibrant democracy. No, what is wrong with anti-Zionism is that it means that of all the 193 UN member states, you think that only the one Jewish state doesn't have a right to exist. That's what anti-Zionism is, and that's why anti-Zionism specifically, believing that of all the countries in the world, Israel is the only one that doesn't have a right to exist, is anti-Semitism. But people use Zionist and think that it's some sort of an extremist point of view. I've been really shocked to hear the way that other people have defined it for me when I've been in just honest conversations with them. And I did a podcast recently where I defined it that way, and the guy actually stopped and he Googled it, and he's like, yeah, he's like, that's exactly what it says. He was shocked because to him it was like an extremist movement that, believes that God gave the land to the Jewish people, and therefore only Jews can live there, and that everything was religious based and extremely. And I'm like, it's not actually. I mean, the original Zionists, the pioneers of the state of Israel. Now, Zionism is a theme of a Jewish yearning that has existed since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, and then after the third and final Jewish revolt against the Romans that ended in 135 CE, which was called the Bar Kokhba revolts, which we can get into that. But the bottom line is between 135 CE and 1948, when the state of Israel was reestablished, every Jew on Passover said L'Shana Behaba Be'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Every single time a Jew prayed from anywhere in the world, that Jew faced Jerusalem. Every time there was a Jewish wedding, the groom would step on a glass and everybody would shout Mazel Tov, and the breaking of the glass symbolizes the destruction of the Second Temple and this idea that we're still a scattered people and that eventually we'll be put back together when we reconstitute Israel and our homeland. You know, the entire religion it's an ethno-religion. It is land-based. It is both an ethnicity and a religion. Some people struggle with that because of the idea of, well, then if it's an ethnicity, how can there be converts, things like that? And it's actually really simple. And in fact, it's not just Judaism that uses this. You can find it in certain Native American tribes as well that are ethno-religions, that are, you know, based in the land. I mean, there are, of the 613 mitzvot, which actually translates more correctly to commandments than good deeds, which is what most people think it means. A lot of them have to be done in the land of Israel. So basically, a Jew can't be complete, cannot fulfill all the commandments of God unless he or she lives in Israel. One more example is, you know, every year on Shmini Atzeret, the Jews pray for rain for that particular season, and they don't do it based off of where they live anywhere in the world. They're doing it for Israel. So you could be living in, you know, California, but you're praying for rain in Israel. And this was, you know, for 1800 years. About the bottom line is that Zionism is baked into the Jewish soul, the yearning to return to Jerusalem, to return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. There have always been Jews living in the land of Israel. It was just at different levels, especially in the Galilee, even through the Crusades when Jews were massacred, and through different caliphates that tried to convert everybody to Islam, through the, you know, Ottoman Mamluk wars. I mean, there have been so many wars fought over this territory, but there has always been a Jewish presence in the land. And there has been aliyah, back to the land. Aliyah meaning literally to rise up, to go up. And it's the word that Jews use for immigrating to Israel, because you're rising up and returning to your homeland, to Israel. Immigrating to Israel is not considered moving somewhere, it's returning for Jews. You know, every Jew on earth either has their first home or their second home in Israel. But the modern political Zionism that actually led to the forming of the state, because the only debate that has ever existed with Jews is, will we return to Israel when God decides by sending the Messiah, or are we permitted to do God's work and move ourselves back to Israel, which is why most of the original pioneers of modern political Zionism were actually secular, you know, including Theodore Herzl, including the first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, and most of the other founding fathers and mother in Golda Meir were mostly secular Jews, traditional Jews, but still, you know, non-Orthodox. They were specifically, you know, creating a democratic, not a theologic state. And I think a lot of people don't understand that quite either. Here's one of the ways I like to describe it. You're an American. You've lived in America your whole life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to say something, and I want you to finish this, okay? And this might go the way I think, and it might not.
We'll see.
Tell me the first word that comes to your mind. Jews and...
Israel is the first thing that came to my mind.
Just based off of, and a lot of this is, you know, based off of actual data and things like that. Majority of Jews in America, if you say Jews and, they'll say Christians.
Oh.
Yeah. So if you ask an Israeli, the exact same thing. Jews and the vast
Muslims.
majority, no,
Oh.
that's where the difference is. They will say Arabs. And I want you to notice the difference there. Americans tend to struggle. Americans tend to struggle with this idea that Judaism could be anything more than a religion. And there are reasons for that, a lot of them. But I mean, just look at the last census and look at the way that some American Jews who are very aware of this, had troubles responding to it because, for example, in marking race, do we mark white? Not every Jew is white. I mean, okay, so an Ethiopian Jew might put black, but what about a Sephardic Jew? People just had difficulty with this. Plus, white, I mean, that's a very new phenomenon that Jews have suddenly been considered white in America.
I'm actually one of those people. My own family gives me shit for it, but like I remember growing up. I was born in '96. I remember growing up on TV, on the internet. Jews weren't white when I was a young child, and like I saw it, and I was like, okay. I didn't think bad or good. It's like just internalized it, and then all of a sudden, around 2010, things started to switch. Where it's like now I'm white, and if I don't say it, I'm bad. Actually, have even to this day, like kind of an identity issue over it because I'm just like I genuinely don't feel white because what was taught what white was, not by my family or school, just by society, it wasn't this, it wasn't me. And then all of a sudden I'm white at the exact same time when being white is considered bad. And I was
Yeah.
like, wait a minute. And so I am one of those. Sorry to cut you off there for a second.
No, no, please. I want you to jump in as often as you want. Otherwise, I literally will just chunk your head off. So, like I said, those 3,000 pages, they're all up here somewhere, and I'm trying desperately to organize it in my brain as well. So please cut me off anytime. For the Ku Klux Klan, for Nazis, we were not white. We were imposters who some of us could pass for white, but we had non-white blood that was muddying the blood of pure white people. That's the way it was looked. So
Mhm.
we were not white enough, and now suddenly we're too white. And again, that is only for those of us who, I mean, if white is just the amount of melanin in your skin, then somebody watching this is going to say those are two white guys talking. Okay, but whiteness is also about a certain background and culture. It's sort of Anglo-Saxon background. It is I mean, it's sort of hilarious, and if it wasn't so depressing when people try to use the word Jewish privilege, because I'm not really sure when and where there has been privilege. The problem is that we have an entire generation now that has grown up only knowing a world where Jews have been, by and large, proportionately successful in the United States, and where we have a state in the state of Israel that is a military and economic powerhouse, really, even though it's tiny. I think that that's the way it's always been because that's all they've ever known. And both of those things are extremely recent phenomenon. I
Mhm.
mean, Jews by and large have been extremely poor up until the last like 50, 60 years or so. I mean, there were some Jews like the Rothschild family. There have been some that have made it, but for the most part, for centuries, anytime Jews made money, because Jews were not seen as a religion until really, sometime in the last 100 years, and only in certain Western areas. The Greeks called us Judeos, the Romans called us Judeus, both of which translate into Judeans. The land was called Judea, we were called Judeans. And it was not until 1275 CE, more than 1,200 years after the Romans, more than 1,500 years after the Greeks, that the English shortened Judeans to Jews. And so we became Jews. but there is no difference between being a Jew and a Judean. It is the same. We are the people of Judea, this particular land. And so I forgot exactly where I was going on this. This is what happens when I
That's
go
okay.
on
That's okay.
tangents.
That's okay.
Um,
So actually,
Go ahead and jump in. Yeah,
I am learning. Like I enjoy the conversation a ton, and like, however, as you talked about before, a lot of people that might be listening to this, hopefully, at least a few people that are listening to this, don't really have a background. So let's back up to May of 2021, what I call a dark turning, a turning of the cycle, because not just with Jews, but something that I read about a lot are cycles in society, and there's a cycle of the Jewish problem, the Jewish question, or Jewish hatred, and I saw, and as well as you did, saw in 2021, it take a pretty significant turn, a pretty significant step in that cycle. So let's go back to what you were seeing then at that
sure.
time, and kind of how that led us here today.
There were a few things that led, and I should probably talk a little bit more also about what
Mhm.
kind of project it is I'm trying to work on now as well. But we don't need to get to that at this moment. But for me, the dark turn started a little bit earlier than that, and then that became the obvious point for me.
Mhm.
One major thing that happened the year before was I don't know if you follow Barry Weiss, but she was formerly a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Then she was a columnist for the New York Times. Now she has her own media empire, really, called the Free Press, and she is somebody who, it's not like I agree with everything she says. I mean, there's nobody on this earth that I agree with everything they say, but she's somebody who I have always respected her voice and who would speak up on Jewish issues that I found to be worthwhile. And she resigned from the New York Times in 2020, citing and she wrote a very thoughtful resignation letter, which you can find online very easily just by typing in Barry Weiss resignation letter, talking about the harassment and anti-Semitism that she suffered there. About Barry's writing about the Jews again. She was treated extremely poorly by the New York Times, and this was supposed to be the paper of record. And basically, any story that didn't fit the narrative that was developing among a certain segment of the far left was no longer going to be covered by the New York Times. And so she felt that she had to move on. And so that was one of the big sort of red flags for me. Then in 2021, yeah, I mean, it's really simple what actually led to that round of fighting. After, Mahmoud Abbas has been the president of the Palestinian Authority since, oh gosh, what is it, 2000 and I'm trying to think of the exact
I
year.
believe this is his 16th year in office, I
I think
believe.
it's 18th actually,
18th? Okay.
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think that he's been in office 18 years for a 4-year term.
For your
And
term.
and he's in the 18th year of his 4-year term, if I'm not mistaken. I could be off by a year, but I'm pretty sure it's about the 18th year of his
Mhm.
4-year term. And they were finally going to have elections because there was pressure from everywhere, from the United States, from the European Union, from Arab states, to hold elections. And it became clear that he was going to lose those elections to Hamas. So he canceled the elections, and he blamed Israel for canceling the elections, because that's what you always do. You just blame Israel. But I mean, everybody knew what the real reason was. That was ultimately the reason for the outbursts from Hamas and Islamic Jihad starting to fire rockets, because they saw it as a power grab by a boss that he didn't have a mandate from the people for, and he knew it, and he canceled elections. And you can see all this time has passed since then, and he still hasn't called for elections again.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. But people started to try to make it about this Sheikh Jarrah incident, which is really just a real estate dispute where people have been living and renting for 20 years rent free, and think that they shouldn't be evicted. That's really what Sheikh Jarrah was all about. It's even more than that, in more than 30 years. But anyway, so these groups tried to make it about anything and everything else. And so what winds up happening is everything always comes back down to Al-Aqsa, the mosque that is built on the ruins of the first and second temple on the Temple Mount. And that's why that's the most fought over probably tiny piece of territory on the planet, and politically sensitive area on the planet, and religiously sensitive area on the planet. But what winds up happening is uh, there were there was a fight over who was the quote unquote protectors of Al Aqsa. Was it the Palestinian Authority, or was it Hamas, or was it Islamic Jihad? And so the PA started sending in their people to go into Al Aqsa Mosque, and they were piling up rocks and fireworks, firecrackers, and things like that. And they were shooting them down and throwing them down at worshippers and at police, and basically instigating a riot. So the police ultimately had to enter the Al Aqsa compound to stop this violence. And that got, of course, they had the cameras ready to go because this was a setup. So that inflamed everybody. And so then Hamas and Islamic Jihad, these two terror organizations that are both, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a complete puppet of the Iranian regime. Hamas is about 70% funded by Iran. The PA is not. The PA is funded mostly by the United States and the European Union. So they started firing missiles, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, at Jerusalem, which just makes no sense if you think about it to begin with. If this is your holy land, why would you fire missiles at it? Because they're indiscriminately fired. That it's in the direction of Jerusalem, but you don't know where it's going to hit. Besides the fact that, Arab Israelis are just as likely to be hit by missiles as Israelis, quite frankly. It's just that they're 20% of the population, and also 1/3 of their missiles misfire and land in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah,
but that's for another time.
Another time.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that's what that was all about. But it went viral that the Jews were storming Al-Aqsa and were harassing or beating or just stopping from praying Muslims in this holy place. And it was just absurd that was the story, but that was the story. And they said it was all about the Jews trying to take more quote unquote land from the Palestinians, and this was Sheikh Jarrah and all this stuff, which had nothing to do with anything whatsoever. This was all about the elections, and it was an internal power struggle between the Palestinians, and it was who could be labeled as the quote unquote protector of Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. But it inflamed the world, and there had been a change that we've seen on college campuses in terms of taking a more anti-Israel stance, and these Israel apartheid weeks and everything like that, which are disgusting and full of lies. It's absurd to call Israel apartheid, and we can get into that at some point if you'd like. But just to make sure that I'm just answering your question, suddenly there were these very anti-Semitic protests where they're calling essentially for genocide of Jews. They don't say kill all the Jews, but they say, Khaybar Khaybar al Yahud, which they're referring to, the Khaybar massacre when Muhammad and some of his troops massacred Jews in Saudi Arabia, and they're saying we're going to do it again. That's what they're calling for. When they say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they're talking about from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which is Israel. So if Palestine will be free, where do the Jews go? And if you actually ask any of these people, and they have any idea what they're talking about, they say, well, the Jews can go back to wherever they came from. But of course, the Jews don't come from anywhere. We come from Judea. We've been, strangers in other lands for 1,800 years, which is why we have so many problems.
Yeah, one of the wild things I've seen the past few weeks, one of the many, like on top of Jews that have Russian ancestry, there was a flight from Tel Aviv to Russia. There was a pogrom. They broke into the airport. A massive amount of people, broke into, and they would have killed them to get off the plane. But not even that. One of the weird, crazy things I've seen is there was a picture in Poland from the 1940s where it said Jews go back to Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the same area, I think it was the same block, there is now a picture with graffiti of Jews get out of Palestine in the same exact spot. And it's like, Well, like that is the Jewish problem right there. Like right there, you just defined it in a block, and the two pictures like 80 years apart. It's just
Yep.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
wild.
I mean, it's Jews are always in this sort of weird middle ground, where we're either not white enough or we're too white. We either all need to go back to Israel or we all need to leave Israel. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
We're either all communists or we're all capitalists. I mean, it's just
yeah,
anti-Semitism doesn't require logic. It's just whatever society's ills are, the Jews are the scapegoat, and that's just the way that it's been. I mean, Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague and were burned alive by the thousands in the 1300s, to the point where by the end of the 14th century, there were only 1,000 Jews left in all of France and Germany. I mean, that's not a lot. It's been, these massacres are nothing new to Jews. It's the norm. In fact, it's been described that really since World War II up until these more recent years, that particularly American Jews have been on a holiday from history, and that holiday
mm,
is now over. Um, you know, there was a certain amount of sympathy that went the Jews' way after the Holocaust, and not from everybody. Their Arab League and Arab countries were still calling for the extermination of Jews in 47, 48, 56, 67, 73. I mean, until still are today. That's when wars were fought between Israel and various Arab neighbors. Just specifically this time period that we've been talking about, this 2021, you know, the there were two things I remember that really were the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Were, I mean, the people going through the streets of London screaming, kill the Jews and rape their daughters. And based off of what just happened now, we know that that was not just words, that was actually what they wanted to do. Um, Actually, of all things, it was a segment that John Oliver did that sort of pushed me over the ledge. Because, again, John Oliver is not somebody with whom I agree all the time by any means. I found him entertaining, and I found him intelligent to where even if I completely disagreed with what he's saying, I respected his opinion. And sometimes I completely agreed with what he was saying. It depended on the issue, but I was entertained, and I appreciated the fact that he was trying to be intellectual about things while still being entertaining and funny. And in the 2021 conflict, he did a segment on Israel, and it was lies from start to finish. Obvious lies to anybody who knows anything about the region, about the history, about what was going on. And in a way, it kind of broke my heart. That it was like, I mean, he doesn't know me, he doesn't owe me anything, but I felt sort of betrayed because this was somebody who I had respect for and thought, had a certain amount of integrity. And after that, I realized I can't believe any word that this guy's ever said if he can be so blatantly, I don't want to call him out as being an anti-Semite because I don't know what's in the man's heart, but he's either been severely misled, and manipulated, or he's an anti-Semite. It's really one or the other, because it was loaded with lies, and it cut me deeply because I really enjoyed his show up to then, regardless of whether I agree with him or not. And it was actually after that that I started finally trying to arrange my notes. And again, during this entire time, I'm working a 60-hour a week job as an attorney. I have a wife and a young son as well, so busy life. But I also started doing, and I'm not much of an artist necessarily, but I, was trying to figure out how is it that the younger generation is getting their information these days outside of, the normal places. And, at that time, Twitter was still, what was it, 170 characters or something like that? I can't even, I was
140.
140 characters. Yeah.
Yeah.
The 140 characters. So basically the way that young people were getting their information was either through emotional buzzwords that could fit into 140 characters, or the exact opposite extreme of like 3+ hour podcasts. I think that a lot of people just sort of put on their headphones while they're doing something else and just have a podcast running in the background, and they're listening to it at, 1.5 speed. That's one of the other ways they get it. We're not going to win the emotional buzzwords competition because right now in the world, Israel is seen as the Goliath and the Palestinians are seen as the David, even though it's an absurdity because people show the map of Israel and they show it with Israel and the so-called West Bank and Gaza Strip taking up the entire screen. But if you zoom out just a little bit, you see the entire massive Arab world, and you can't even see this tiny little speck that makes up 0.01% of the entire landmass of planet Earth. That's all it is. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a ridiculous way of looking at things. But regardless, the one other way that I saw this generation was learning things specifically historically based because I wanted people to understand the history. There's a YouTube channel, I don't know if you've heard of it, called Oversimplified.
We spoke about it.
It's not, yeah, I don't know any of them. They've never met me. I've never met them, but I appreciate what they do. And they do animations that are more South Parkian than they are Leonardo da Vinci. You know what I mean? But they're still really well done and professionally done. And they tell history using these animations with pithy dialogue. And it's just sort of fun to watch. And I saw that some of their videos had hundreds of millions of views. So I'm like, oh, this is insane. So I'm like, okay, so there's Twitter, there's podcasts, and there's also this animated history, way. And these are ways that you could potentially reach, the younger generation. So I just downloaded the first animation program that came up in the App Store. And, I figured it'll just be some stress relief, to do a little bit each day to just try and, because again, not an artist. It's something that I like and that I have a passion in, so I can make it passable and not bad by any means. In fact, if you go to my Twitter page at Captain Allen History, you'll see a few of those stills from the animations. Any of those drawings that you see are some of mine. So you can see that a lot of effort went into it, regardless of whether or not you think it's good or bad. But I started making these animations, and since then I've got about 90 minutes worth of very first draft, rough draft animations with a script that I just need help from somebody who's got a professional background in this stuff to help me produce it and to make it look a little better. And then I want to break it up into smaller segments, and I want to get them out there as a way of hopefully being able to reach people in that different way. And right now it goes from like Abraham all the way up to the mid 19th century. So I still have plenty to go. I haven't even gotten to the Holocaust yet. I'm still in the 1800s. But regardless, so my goal essentially was to try to ultimately be in as many platforms as possible that the younger generation doesn't just have to ultimately, if you want to seek out the truth about Israel and Jewish history, you can find it. So my goal is to put it in places and make it fun and interesting and digestible where the younger generation is going to just stumble upon it. They don't have to necessarily search for it. They can just stumble upon it. So that eventually means, right now I've got it through X, and that's where I'm trying to build the sort of following. And I think I've been pretty successful in a short period of time like that. I opened the account on July 31st, but I was still working as an attorney at that time. And so I wasn't really posting very much at the beginning, just a couple of things here and there. More recently, I decided there were some personal reasons as well that I wanted to take some time off and away from work. And I really just wanted to give this a go as, a passion project and see if I could make a career out of it. And I still don't know how it's all going to go. It's still very much in the early stages, and I can't go without a paycheck for much longer. So I'm going to have to try to turn this into something ASAP. Regardless, I think I've already made a dent, which makes my life to me more meaningful as it is, that I've, just brought information that people otherwise didn't have. Even if I change one person's mind, it's kind of like the Talmud, to save a life is it's as if you've saved the whole world. And I kind of feel the same way about bringing information to people. If I change one mind, it's as if I changed the mind of the whole world, because who knows how many people that person might ultimately influence with that information. And so that's basically what I'm now trying to do, an extraordinarily gigantic project to try to do on your own. So I've been reaching out to people, and I'm in discussions with people trying to do this on a broader scale. But in the meantime, I'm just getting out, historically verifiable posts on X to, just give history and context. And, I started doing this still, a couple months before the, massacre of October 7th. So, in a way, it almost seemed, to use a Jewish word, basher, like it was meant to be that I would have this and be starting to do this even a couple months before that happened, because I always knew the way that Israel was fighting its battles against Hamas, it was only a matter of time before there was another outbreak of violence. But I never expected this. I mean, nobody did. I expected, a flurry of rockets and then a response, and it would go on for a couple of weeks, and there'd be
Mhm.
condemnations coming around all against Israel, and then they'd be forced to stop without actually taking out Hamas. But this time it was obviously much worse, much more severe, a lot more deaths and gruesome mutilations and rapes and burning of babies in their cribs and just the most awful things you could think of, really. And so to me, it's just sort of, you know, it feels like I have to give this everything I've got right now, for as long as I can. And if I can make it work long term, awesome. And that's what I hope to do. And I do have plans that I want to do. It's just a really hard thing to do on my own, and that's how I've been doing it so far. So that's why I'm also, anybody who hears this and wants to help out, if you have, any sort of skills in terms of animation, or if you have enough of a historical background, you want to help me in terms of broadening this on other social media platforms, or, you and I were talking about things like with this podcast, etc. That's something I'm looking to do, because I realize that trying to do this alone is impossible. But I still think I'm making a difference with the things that I'm doing. I'm putting things out there that people have never seen before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, no,
uh,
and just to let you know, I think I don't think I'm alone. And when I came across your account on X, I don't think I'm alone. Where I'm like, oh my god, like, this is one of those voices that needs to be spread. Like this is very important, and I am dead serious. Like I will dedicate this podcast to you. And also, I have a very varied background in the corporate world where I started my own tiny company. I was a vending machine company in college, but like I got like a lot of experience in marketing that way. And I got my CPA. I've worked in finance, and I don't know if that's going to help as much at this point. But I've worked in finance and M&A and all that, and now I've worked in tech consulting. I'm now working in sales, and I think the sales piece could help a lot. Where I'm like, okay, I understand how to go find different resources. I can't remember the name now, but the woman that was at New York Times and started the Free Press. What is her name?
very wise.
Very wise. So like one of the things that popped in my head during the conversation was like, I wonder if I can figure out how to find her. If I dedicate an hour to like trying to find her contact information and like, getting in contact, I wonder if I can do that.
It's out
Um,
there. The free press is
um,
what, and she has Twitter as well. I think she's fabulous. I really do. Again, it doesn't mean that I endorse everything she's ever said,
of
but
course.
she and I share common goals. Let's put it
Hmm.
that way.
Yeah, and like for me, if I could do anything to, and I don't have these type of resources or background, but like something that comes into my mind. Speaking of someone I don't agree with a lot, but the Daily Wire, like they're doing what you kind of want to do. Where they're creating their own programs for kids, and like, dang, if we could just get Captain Allen, we can get Eric in front of these guys. This is something they'd fund 100% because it's such a good thing, such a good deed, and like so knowledgeable. That's what I want to do. And part of doing that, as well as picking up the phone and sending out emails like, "Hey, this is who I am."
Yeah.
Part of doing that is also let's have you talk as much as you can. Let's just put you in
Yeah.
front of as many ears and eyes as much as we can, because like I want to do my part. And like, a lot of these books are Jewish history books, and at this point in my life, like every day, I'm reading or listening to something like that, and I'd say I'm more knowledgeable than 98% of humans on the planet about this stuff. But the difference between 98% and getting to those last 2% is a lot, and that's who you are. And it's just so damn important that you are inspiring people like me who just like, okay, we found a guy. Like, let's get this elevated because this is important. And if we can do whatever we can, just keep making impacts that way. I'm happy to, I guess, quote unquote, be a soldier in that sense. If that's my
No, I,
role, which if that
yeah.
seems to be my role, it's something that we need to make happen. I'm going to put in that effort to help make that happen.
Well, thank you. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You said that at least a post or some posts of mine sort of caught your attention as something different and unique. Are there any in particular that you recall?
Yeah, so I can recall the very first one I saw that made me scroll your Twitter for like an hour. I know it was such an educational hour. It was the start of the 6 Day War. And there's another one about occupation and like, hey, let's define what occupation is. Let's go through this. But the first one I saw, the start of the 6 Day War, and it was a Twitter thread, and you responded to it, and someone tried to like be a smartass, and you're like, oh, okay, well, hey, let's talk about it. It was all very professional, first off, which is an important thing. It's something that I've talked about with David Frey, who's a really big. I reached out to him yesterday, and I'm sure he'll get back to me at some point. I've had him on the podcast. He has 500,000 followers on Twitter, on X. Really big name, and it's something I've talked to him about. It's like, hey, you have this message. And it's more of a Republican message, not a Jewish one, but so you have this message. But when you go on X and you call people stupid and you call them idiots, and like, yeah, you're gonna get the likes and you're gonna get followers from the people that you want to, that agree with you, but no one else is gonna listen.
Right.
And you went about it in a way where it's like, you're gonna get people to listen. And it's like, okay, so that was the first thing that caught my eye, first off. But then I go through the post and it's messages from Egyptian radio stations and it's updates of quotes from leaders and generals. And I was like, and you walk us through step by step by step how this happened. And I was like, oh my God, like this, like, wow, I was absolutely blown away by it. And again, all verifiable things. And I was like, holy shit, like
Yeah.
this is how we have to fight because the truth is on our side. And what's not on our side are the buzzwords, as you mentioned. They can just throw out
Yeah.
things like genocide, apartheid, whatever. And it's like the kids are just gonna be like, oh yeah. And like, by the way, on my Instagram isn't dedicated to the fights, so to speak. It's just my personal friends and family, about 500 people, I think, I'm following and follow me back. And what I'm seeing on there is it's all these buzzwords. And I'm just like, gosh, it's so wrong. And we can't just throw those buzzwords. And our responsibility is just to share truth and share knowledge, just have the conversation at an adult level. I'm 27, and for some reason, like I don't consider myself. I mean, I look around at 30-year-olds and still think they're kids, but like at the same time, it's like at some point you just got to grow up and be an adult about things. And so I don't look at myself as like a child necessarily, but even at my age, it's still the same freaking childish dialogue. And it's easy to do on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, but if that's how you're learning, that's a problem. So there's a few accounts that I'm just like, okay, this is somebody that's good, but I've never seen, honest. I swear to God, I honestly, I've never seen the combination of respectful, knowledgeable, verifiable information that I've seen coming from your account. It really did blow
Appreciate
me
that.
away. So that was the one,
How,
the 6 Day
yeah.
War one, and then I came across another one that was talking about occupation, what occupation means, what's a legal occupation, what's an illegal occupation, and just all these examples. And I was, the more I looked into it, the more and more I'm like, yes, this. So like, yeah, man, honestly, it's
I
incredible.
appreciate it. Those were part of two of my favorite posts that I've done. It was a part one and a part two on just answering the question: does Israel occupy the West Bank? Using, even though West Bank is a term that has only existed since Jordan occupied the land in 1948 and then annexed it illegally in a move that was not recognized in 1950. And they called it the West Bank because it was on the west bank of the Jordan River. It had been Judea and Samaria to the Jews for 3,000 years before then. So that's why it's sort of, I call it the West Bank because that's what you hear in the media so often. And so as not to confuse people, and people tend to look at people who use the words Judea and Samaria as, oh, you must be an extremist, but it's it's sort of the opposite way around. So I like to explain that to people, but nonetheless, that was all part of the same, back to back tweets on, is there an occupation, and having and discussing the 6 Day War and the lead up to that and how that all happened, it was all really part two. And because these are long tweets, very long, they can be overwhelming. And so what I try to do is tell it like a story. Um,
Yes.
every one of these things can be told like a story so that you feel like you're there. I wanted, when you were reading about the lead up to the 6 Day War, those several weeks before, and everything that was happening on a daily basis, I wanted you to feel what it felt like to be an Israeli, feeling like the second Holocaust was at your doorstep, and legitimately. The threats were there. They were extremely outnumbered, extremely outgunned, and nobody had Israel's back then. Nobody was supplying Israel with arms then. People think that this relationship between the United States and Israel has always been there, and it hasn't. The United States has generally supported Israel, but there was an arms embargo against Israel during its entire war of independence, and then for the next, majority of the next 20 years after that. It really wasn't until Israel proved that it was here to stay after the stunning victory in the 6 Day War that suddenly the United States started to see Israel as a bastion of American style democracy in the Middle East that could counteract the Soviet influence over the Arab states, as the Soviet Union was arming the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordanians and the Iraqis and the Saudi Arabians. And, so there have been changes obviously since the Cold War now as well. Before I get into too much history, the bottom line is each one of these issues can be complex and can just put people to sleep. And so my goal is to try to tell it like a story so that it's interesting, so that people want to read on. And that's also why I try to do it through these animations, to make it engaging and entertaining, because the history is important, but not everybody spends their spare time watching documentaries like me. You know what I mean? Like, I get
Yeah.
that. Like, I'm weird like that. I'm not average. I'm not normal. Like that the fact that I enjoy doing that is not an average thing to do. And so I can't expect that other people are going to be as fascinated in this stuff as I am. And so I have enough background in writing styles. I have a background in journalism as well, and then also with writing legal briefs and things like that, and having to take really complex ideas and try to dumb them down as much as possible for a jury or something like that. It's really the best way to go about complex facts, is to tell them by a story, one
Mhm.
where it paints a picture so that the audience, your readers, can empathize, can feel what those people were feeling at that particular time, and what a miraculous thing it was that Israel won that war the way that it did. And so that's why I really appreciate the fact that those were the tweets that grabbed your attention, because I spent countless hours putting those together, because the original drafts of those tweets were probably 180 pages long.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So yeah, because there's just so much information. So really, the hardest part of the job that I'm trying to do is whittling it down to the most important facts, and then finding a way to tell it in a fashion that is interesting, that is story-like, that can grab a person's attention. And I'm not always going to be successful in that, but that's really what I try to do. One of my favorite tweets that I've done so far was before this latest massacre and war started. I just did a tweet on how the Mossad really made a name for itself among international intelligence organizations, the Mossad being the Israeli version of
Mhm.
the CIA. And it was, I basically told a all factual story, but I wrote it like a spy thriller, because that's really what it is. How Israel managed to get its hands on Russia's latest technology, the MiG-21 at the time, which was supposed to be the most highly advanced fighter jet on the planet. And the Americans were dying to get their hands on it. The British were dying to get their hands on it. And it was Israel that managed to get their hands on it. And Russia demanded to get it back, and Israel said no. And that was ballsy for this little country to be doing. And eventually, after things died down a little bit, they allowed the Americans and the British to come and spend as much time as they wanted. And so people started to see Israel as real players. But it was just it's an incredible spy thriller story about Israel using sort of a honeypot agent, a female agent who got close with an Iraqi Christian who had issues with government. The Soviets at the time were arming the Iraqis, and so they had the MiG 21, and this guy was one of the fighter pilots. And anyway, you could read the tweet if you want, but it was one of the more fun ones to write. And so I hope to be able to write more fun ones like that. Right now, I feel like I have a duty to try to stay focused on issues that are related to the war because there's just so much misinformation out there. It's a battle. It's part of the war. I mean, it has been proven that Iran and Hamas fund people to actually go and post on X or on Instagram or on TikTok, just to push their narrative. I was reading an article earlier today or maybe yesterday. They actually have these fake correspondents, independent journalists, but they're all funded by Iran, and they're in Gaza. They even wear the blue jackets that say press on them, and they're reporting, and it's all propaganda. Everything's staged. It's part of the war. And not as young as I once was. I'm not as able-bodied as I once was. I don't think that the IDF would take me just based off of my back alone. So this is my way to fight the war. I have a certain knowledge and skill set that I feel can make at least a dent of a difference. I hope to make a big difference, but even if I make a small one, I feel like I'm doing something worthwhile. So yeah, I'm happy that it was those tweets that grabbed you, because I really worked hard on those to take some very complex ideas and make them interesting. And so the fact that they grabbed your attention and they kept your attention, yeah, that means everything to me.
It worked. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, and as far as like it's part of the war, that's kind of what I keep telling myself too. It's kind of more of a personal note. When I talk to my family in Israel, especially like they're seeing my Instagram. They're not most people I know don't follow me on Twitter. It's all strangers. But when I talk to them, it's like, hey, make sure you're taking care of yourself. Like you're clearly going through survivor's guilt. I'm like, what's survivor's guilt? They're like, well, you feel like they're kind of like assuming like, yeah, you feel like you don't even have a right to just like be living your life, and that it's like, oh, why am I an American versus an Israeli, and I'm not laying my life on the ground, and it's all these things. I'm like, oh my god, yeah, it's exactly how I feel, and I do feel a strong need to do my part as one of, and I don't know a ton. Like when I talk to people like you, it's like it's evident to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much to learn. But I'll talk to people like you a lot. Most of the time, I'm talking like, oh my god, they don't know anything. I have to do this. No one knows anything. Jews, even American Jews, even. I'm like, I have to do something, and this is the best I can serve. And I would gladly, keep bringing you back. I am dead serious. Like, I would change the name of the podcast. I would glad to keep bringing you back on and doing what we can here, because you have made a small dent already. You've made a small dent, and you've done great things. And as long as you can keep fighting, like I'm a part of that unit, man.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, yeah,
Hey,
yeah,
I'm going to put you on the spot here. So
yeah.
if you don't have an answer, we can just move on. Is there anything that's sort of burning in your own mind, an area of Jewish history or current event that, you know, either you feel like you don't know that much about, or you wish you knew more about, or that worries you or bothers you, or anything like that, that I might be able to just, discuss with you right here and now, just on the spot? And again, if you don't have anything, just as we're sitting here, we could do it another time. But if anything
Um,
comes to mind, I'd love to just have an opportunity to just off the
yeah,
cuff, just talk about it.
yeah. So I guess my biggest worry, I guess I'll answer that in a few parts here. So first off, as far as what I don't know, I think what I don't know mostly is pre 1900. Like I know that our people of all this is. I mean, we say it at Passover, right? Like in each generation, they will rise up and try to kill us. And I know it's always been a thing. And I like the quote you used a lot of, American Jews have been on vacation for 70 years and now they're finally back. Yeah, 100%. And honestly, what I worry about most, and I feel like I want to wake people up to most, is like first and foremost Israel. friends and family, and not even friends and family, just Israelis, just like just surviving and being okay. But then when you go past that to the diaspora and America, where I am and where half the Jews are almost, I want people to like wake up to the what this cycle is and like, hey, yeah, right now today is scary, but to be honest, I'm not scared most vast majority of the time. I'm not scared for like my immediate life or my family's immediate life in America. It's what is 2050 going to look like? Because I've seen 1920 Germany, 1930s Germany, and it looked like this. I've studied what Spain looked like, what Russia looked like, and what Morocco and Iraq looked like in the 1900s, and it looked like this. And I think a lot of people, I mean, just Jews even, I mean, most people was just the whole thing so foreign and they don't want to say anything because, well, they have friends on both sides. They don't want to lose their friends and whatever. But even Jews, I think a lot of them are just like, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I think a lot of them are just like, oh, right now, today is scary. It's like, no. Like, yeah, it is in Israel and it should be today in Israel. And we should be focused on that and donating and dedicating time. Like, no, today is not scary. It's what's 30, 40, 50 years from now going to look like that could be scary. So if you know
I'm
anything
not sure if
about,
it'll
if
be
that makes
that
you think of
long from
anything,
now. I think saying
yeah,
30, 40,
yeah,
50 years is very optimistic. Things have really taken a dark turn fast. I mean, the fact is, there were people on the streets of New York City in Times Square on October 7th when the massacre happened before Israel had a chance to even respond in any way. And they were marching in favor of what Hamas had just done.
yeah,
And it wasn't a small group of people, it was
yeah.
massive. I mean, in Sydney, Australia, they were marching and screaming, "Gas the Jews." This is, there are various kinds of anti-Semitism. There's, right-wing anti-Semitism, which is usually the form of like, the neo-Nazi type of anti-Semitism. There's left-wing anti-Semitism, which is usually in the form of anti-Zionism, which we discussed earlier. And
Mhm.
then there's Islamic anti-Semitism, which it can be religious based, it can be conspiratorial based, it can be land based, but nonetheless, it's its own animal. And now that especially with the Syrian civil war and the spread of Arab Muslims throughout Europe and other Western countries, there has been this team up, this intersectionality team up between the left and Arabs, which is ridiculous in some ways. For example, the most ridiculous being obviously Queers for Palestine, because obviously they would not find themselves alive trying to live as queers in any place called Palestine. Penalty for homosexuality is death. Whereas in Israel, there is a vibrant communities of all walks of life, including LGBTQIA plus peoples. With this new sort of woke intersectionality, putting Jews sort of at the bottom of the totem pole, looking at Jews as privileged white people, and looking at Arabs as, for some reason, even though they're pretty much the same skin color as Jews for the most part. In fact, if you look at Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, if they were wearing the exact same clothes and had the same
Can't tell
haircuts
them
and the
apart.
same facial hair, you probably couldn't even tell them apart. Exactly. But they're looked at as the darker skinned minority, and we're the powerful, lighter skinned, white people. So we're the oppressors and they're the oppressed. And it's just like, wow, like that does not fit the history of Israel at all. I mean, especially in America, when people try to look at Israel through an American prism, they look at Israel and see Jim Crow. I mean, they look at Israel and they see, slavery and racism, and I'm like, gosh, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about a lot of things, and racism doesn't even make the list. I
Yeah,
mean, just to be honest, like if you know anything about the conflict and how it's gone on, like it doesn't even make the list of things that it's about. It's about 50 different things before. I mean, sure, racism exists to some degree in
exist
every
everywhere.
society.
Exist
Yeah,
everywhere.
exactly.
Yes,
But
yes.
the conflict, to claim that that is about racism, all that shows is your ignorance about the conflict. It shows that you know nothing about it and that you're just trying to apply American sensibilities to a completely different culture with a completely different history and background. So that's another thing that sort of drives me nuts. And it's gained traction, in the United States and on some of our elite campuses. And I mean, the fact that this is going on in Harvard and Columbia and Stanford, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And right now, if my son got a full scholarship to Harvard, I wouldn't send him. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
no,
Like, how
I
insane is that?
not that I have
It's
the
insane.
power. Yeah, not that I have the power to it, but I personally would never hire from these places.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's something that needs to change. I don't know if it will, because again, we're just such a small number of people, and our influence is just so greatly blown out of proportion. But like, I wish we had the influence these people think we had, but we don't.
It's like the Colleyville thing. Do you remember that? What happened with
Which one?
Colleyville?
Which one was
So
Colleyville?
Colleyville is a small town in Texas. He was I believe, an Arab Muslim. He was a Muslim. I'm not 100% positive he was Arab, but he was from the UK. And he had been led to believe his whole life that the Jews are all powerful. And he wanted to have uh, a female Al Qaeda member terrorist released from jail. And so he came to a synagogue in an area that was, I think, close to where she's being held. And he was there with a gun and he held people hostage for an entire day. He was demanding that the rabbi get an Al Qaeda terrorist released from jail. I can't do. And the guy, I mean, the guy was convinced that he'd be able to do that. Then he made him get on the phone with a rabbi in New York and say, "Oh, he can do it. Make him do it." And that, like, what are you talking about? I mean, these people believe it that much that we are this all powerful people, that we're this tiny. There are 2.5 billion approximately Christians in the world, 2 billion approximately Muslims in the world. There's only 15 million Jews. We're
Yeah,
tiny.
yeah,
We're barely a blip on the radar.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's
It's
crazy.
so, but I mean, so that was another thing that sort of drove me crazy. Now that one, amazingly, it's a crazy story. I think it was the rabbi. They had him warm down over the day, and he just like threw a chair, and everybody started running, and they all made it out of there alive. So that, maybe why as many people haven't heard about Colleyville, because unless it's a mass casualty event like what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in
Mhm.
Pittsburgh, less people hear about it. But when you hear the motivations of the guy who was holding it up, you realize just how serious this problem is. I
Yeah, it's
mean,
wild.
it's what entire generations now have been taught
In
in
school.
schools and in mosques, and you know what I mean, like UNRWA funded schools in the West Bank and in Gaza have textbooks that are just loaded with anti-Semitism, that portray the Israelis as settler colonialist Europeans, that completely erase Israel from their maps and just list it as Palestine. They have, examples of math problems that involve if one suicide bomber takes out 7 Jews and another one takes out 4 Jews, and things like that. And you go to a website called Memory, MEMRI. It's basically all they do is read Arabic papers and watch Arabic television in all these different countries. And when they see something that is obscene and anti-Semitic, they will put a clip of it, and they will give the English translation. I mean, you can see like the Palestinian version of Mickey Mouse teaching kids that the greatest thing that they could ever strive to be is a martyr killing themselves while killing Jews for Allah. I mean, you see kids singing songs about murdering Jews. I mean, it's to the extent that this can ever be changed, it really is going to have to take on something similar to what had to be done in Germany after World War II of the denazification. I mean, it's like the dehammasification of Palestinian territories, because entire generations there now are completely convinced that there was a Palestinian state, which, by the way, has never
Never
existed
was.
in the history of the planet, and that the Jews came from Europe, even though more than half of the Jews in Israel today are of Sephardic or Mizrahi origin, are not European, and stole their land and kicked them all out and have been killing them and massacring them ever since. And that's just the narrative they've been told. It's what they believe. I mean, there's also another YouTube channel, like another guy who I don't know, I've never met, so but somebody who I've come to appreciate. He's called the Ask Project, and he takes questions from his viewers. He is a Canadian Israeli Jew. I believe he's also homosexual, which does play a role into some of these questions that
Mhm.
he'll ask because he knows, about the Queers for Palestine thing and how ridiculous that is. Anyway, he will ask very provocative questions of both Israelis and of Palestinians. And he will go into the West Bank with an Arabic speaker. He doesn't tell them he's a Jew. He doesn't tell them he's Israeli. He just tells them he's Canadian. And they
Yeah.
ask for these provocative questions. And, so you get sort of just the man on the street or woman on the street and their perspective. And nearly every single one of them tells you that the occupation began in 1948, not in 1967. In other
Yeah.
words, all of Israel is an occupation of Palestine. They're not interested in sharing the land. They think that we have no rights to the land. I mean, that's really what it all comes down to at the end of the day. That's why there's never been peace that's been able to be made between the Israelis and even the Palestinian Authority. It's because once it comes down to it, and Israel demands that this has to be the end of all claims, they can't sign. They refuse to sign because while they may be willing to accept the West Bank and Gaza as, temporarily a state, their ultimate goal is the quote unquote liberation of all of Palestine. And so it can't be the end of claims. It can't be the end of the conflict. Um, they have the most any Palestinian leader has been able to say is they recognize that Israel does exist. Great. No Palestinian leader has ever been able to say or has been willing to say that Israel has a right to exist. In other words, they have come to, some of them, respect our might, that they can't just get rid of
Yeah.
us so easily. So they
Yeah.
recognize that we do exist, but they have not recognized our right to be there. And again, it's not necessarily like asking them to admit that we have a better right than they do, just that we also have a right to that land. And if we could just come to that agreement that the Jews have a right to the land and the Arabs have a right to the land, then there can be potentially compromise. But the quote unquote pro-Palestinian movement has really, from its inception, always been about, it hasn't been about building a Palestinian state. It has been about destroying the Israeli state. And I mean, that, I would need an entire session for us to go through that. But I'm telling you that, you can just trust me for now, and then I can give you all the
I
information another
I
time.
know it,
But
but
it's
in
historically
another
accurate.
session,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Yeah.
do know it, but in another session, I would love to talk about it. Because one of the things that I mean, we'll wrap it up here soon. We're going an hour 20, probably wrap it up here like an hour 30. But one of the things like just completely ignored. A lot of things are completely ignored. There was no intention to create a Palestine in the first place. It was intention to have land split mostly between Jordan and Egypt. There wasn't going to be a Palestinian state until Israel won a war. And then this Palestinian state, the idea of a Palestinian state pops up in the 60s. It gets a flag. I think in 66, they create their flag. Arafat, who's an Egyptian leader, becomes their leader. And it's just like, wait. Like, I do think one day, maybe not actually, like October 7th has changed everything. But I do think one day there can be two states. It's just so ironic that there would never be a Palestine if it wasn't for Israel. If Israel didn't exist first, there never would have been a Palestine. And that's something that's just going to be ignored forever. But I know I'd love to talk about it in
Sure.
detail in another session. As much
Sure.
as I do want to learn about and like maybe create a series even of like, let's go from this time period to this time period.
Sure.
I think a great place to
Be happy
start
to do
would
that.
be maybe from like 1920 to
So start of the mandate.
1973. I think that would be like a really I think that's like probably the most important part.
Even that could be broken up into several
I
segments.
know,
I mean,
I
it depends on
know.
how detailed you want to get. There's one thing before we get off, and because I want, it goes to something that you said. And so for you, and also for anybody who's listening who's interested, I've now done a few podcasts. I'm going to be posting links to them because they're now finally starting to come out and they're being published. I'm going to do it probably after Shabbat, so look for them on Sunday. So there's this. I did a podcast called "Still Unbelievable" with it was one British guy and one American guy, and we wound up doing 2 parts. And like the first part was like 3 hours, the second part was like 2.5, because there was just a lot to talk about, and they were sort of found themselves fascinated by a history that they never had heard. So
Mhm.
I do my best to keep it interesting, but those can be long slogs. But the next one that I just did a few days ago, her name is Becky Neiman. Her name of her channel is Dr. I believe it's David Neiman, who was her father, a YouTube channel. And the reason that I bring this up is because you were talking about, not knowing so much about the history pre 1900s, and what she wanted me to cover, and what I did cover in about a 2 hour and 20-minute YouTube podcast, was the history of waves of Aliyah back to Israel and
Mhm.
the communities in Israel that remained even after the exile, basically starting from the 300s when Jews started coming back under the Byzantine Emperor Julian, all the way up through the first Aliyah of 1878. So we covered about 1,500 years of history in about 2 hours and 26 minutes, but very specifically on this idea of, tell me when Jews started moving back, and tell me about the communities that continued to exist even after the loss of sovereignty. So since that was an area that you had mentioned you would have some interest in, please look for
Yeah,
that link
absolutely.
that I
Yeah.
will send out probably on Sunday. But I can also just send it out to you now if you're interested, and you can send it out to your readers. It's really just been a very busy week for me, and I haven't had a chance to even watch it myself, and so I wanted to at least watch it myself before I
Yeah,
posted it. But
yeah.
it's fine. I mean, I'm not worried about it. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure that you knew
Yeah, no,
about
I'd love
that.
to. I'd love to hear that because I mean,
Yeah,
that's definitely an area where I lack expertise. I do think I've done a really good job of the last 3 years or so of learning the recent history. I'd say the last 100 years. But yeah, no, I that's definitely somewhere where I lack expertise. And actually, a question I'm gonna get to at some point, but just as I this pops in my head now, Noah Tishby. I'm sure you know who that is.
yeah, I love Noah. She's
Yeah,
terrific.
so her book, Israel: A Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country
I've
on
read
Earth.
it. It's terrific.
Terrific, terrific book. It's where I recommend people start.
It is a good start. It was
But
a little
I
basic for me,
yeah,
but
no, for you, yeah.
I
It's
thought
so
it was
when I have
well done. I thought it
yeah,
was very well done.
when I have like non-Jewish people, which a few have reached out and asked, which means a lot. But non-Jewish people ask like, "Hey, where like I don't like what is going on? Like, where do I start?" I'm like, "Hey, read this book. This is a great starting point." And at the end of it, she says, "What you need to do is arm yourself with facts,
Mhm.
and then you go fight the good fight." That quote kind of stuck with me, and that topic in specific of, hey, this we've been coming back here since the diaspora for thousands of years now. And if I have facts to back that up, it's all more the more facts you have, the more truth you can speak is important. And for us, again, to say it again, just like we have to speak the truth, and we have to speak facts, and we have to do it in a way that gets people to listen because we don't have buzzwords. And
Right,
it's just not it's not what we're allowed to use. We are outnumbered a million
massively.
to one,
Yeah.
massively, massively.
And now that
So
Russia's getting involved too, we'll have Russian disinformation to worry about as well. I don't know if you've seen my posts on how the
good.
KGB actually created the PLO. It sounds like a
No.
conspiracy theory, but it actually all comes from the highest ranking Soviet defector to the United States in history, a lieutenant general named Ilyan Pechepa, who tells the whole story about how they created the PLO as a way of destabilizing the Middle East and spreading their influence and destabilizing an American ally in Israel. It's interesting to read about because I mean the
Interesting.
PLO didn't exist until 1964, and the original charter of the PLO at Article 24 actually specifically states that they are not seeking any territorial claims over the West Bank that had been annexed by Jordan, or over the Gaza Strip, which had been occupied by Egypt. So the only land that they were seeking to liberate, the PLO, was Israel.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
That didn't change until after 1967, that they decided to switch tactics. But anyway, there's so much more to get to, but I want to mention one thing because you were talking about good books to start with. I have
Yes.
one recommendation that I'll just throw out there as well that is also an easy read, but that is filled with facts and is very interesting and very well done. And that would be Daniel Gordis's book, Israel: A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. It's Terrific. Really, if you want to just be inspired, he's taken some political stances recently. This isn't about that. I stay out of the politics. I'm more interested in the history. And when it comes to history and Jewish identity, I don't think there's too many people better than Daniel Gordis. So basically, anything that he writes on Jewish history and Jewish identity, or anything that you can just look up, speeches that he's given, I mean, rousing. They will get me out of my chair clapping even if I'm on my own. You know what I mean? Like, that might be pushing it a little bit, but I'm just saying, like, I've seen him speak live. I mean, I went on a trip to Israel and he was my quote unquote professor, I guess, for several courses. So I got to know him. So of course I have a bit of a bias toward him as a result of that. But really, he's terrific at taking some of these complex historical points and making them easier to understand. So I would recommend that as another book, in addition to Noah Tishby's, or perhaps it depends on what you want out of it,
Where to
but I would
start?
recommend
Yeah.
that you take a look at it, because he made it pretty easy to read. A very complex topics he made really easy to read. It's not an extremely thick book. It's you can get through it. And quite frankly, for me, I couldn't put it down. And I know that I'm weird in how much I love this stuff, but I've heard the same from a lot of different people. So I would recommend that one as well.
Amazing. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I'm gonna be looking to take a lot more of your time, to be honest. But in the meantime, I'll definitely take a listen to those other two podcasts, or the three, not the
At
two
least the
part.
one on YouTube, because that one goes specifically to the time period that you were talking about, that you said you don't know much about yet.
Yeah,
So
I
that will be a crash course. But I'm telling you, like, the podcasts that I've done up until now have been pretty dense, very history oriented. I try to make it as interesting as possible, but I know that there will be a certain percentage of the audience that won't get through it all. And that's why I appreciate what we did a little bit more here, because there was more back and forth conversational, and I want to try to do more of that to the extent possible. And so I think this was successful, and I'd like to I mean, we can, especially during this time when Israel remains at war, we could do this once a week if you want. I mean, we can
I'd
talk
love
about
to.
stuff like that. Yeah.
I'd
So
love
we can
to.
continue to talk about this off air, but I just wanted to say thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate your kind words and your desire to make a difference, and hopefully together we can make an even bigger dent. Because it's going to take a lot of us. Some of my posts also go into the history of how little American Jews did during the Holocaust. And, it is to our great shame, if you go back and read, not that we were around, but we're American Jews. To
Mhm.
our great shame, we did very little to save Europe's Jews, even though we knew what was happening to them. And so we cannot be silent this time around. We really have to step up. And it's going to take, we can never get all of us, but we need as many of us as possible. We need the closest thing to Jewish unity that we can get.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Eric, once again, thank you for your time. I look forward to talking to you and spreading your voice as best I can. And followers are such a funny thing to me, because it's like I don't want to care about it, but at the same time, it's the more followers you have, the more reach you have. So
Sure.
let's get you as many followers as we can get.
Sounds good.
All
Thanks a
right.
lot. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.